Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to uh, Physics 239, Emergence and Phase Transitions. I'm really excited to see all of you here, and I'm really excited to teach you a topic that I think is really quite fascinating and has turned out to be incredibly useful in physics and in other areas of science. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to explain to you what this course is about and why you should take these courses. This course and this companion course, which isn't going to be taught this year, which is on emergence and order. I'm going to tell you what's in the two different classes. Probably the emergence and order class will be taught next year. And I'm going to really just try and motivate the topic in this lecture, and then we'll get down to business um, after I've done that. I hope everybody got the email that I sent out at the beginning today, just welcoming you to the class and everything. Okay, so make sure that you're signed up on Canvas to get all the announcements. Is anybody here not auditing the class, basically? I know some people do. Yep, that's perfectly fine. So just send me an email with your email address. Just send me an email and your UCSD email address, and I will add you as a auditor to the class so that you then get all the announcements and everything like that. So I use Canvas. The other thing I use is Microsoft Teams. And later on, I'll just show you a little bit about how I use that. And I want to encourage you to use it, not just, just because there's links posted there and things. I'll tell you about that, but also because you can direct message me and we can chat and answer questions about the lectures, about homework, about science, everything. Okay, so let's start off then with the science. I'm going to record this lecture. I'm going to record all the lectures and I post them on YouTube afterwards. So I've already put a link to last year's course, but this year's course will be different because I want you to ask me questions during the class, and you'll ask me questions and I'll go off on tangents. And when I do that, the trajectory of the class gets changed. So I will be recording these lectures also for people who have to miss a lecture. That means I do use Zoom to record them, but I very, very strongly urge you not to attend the classes on Zoom. If you're traveling because you've got, beam time at Brookhaven National Lab or something for your research, okay, of course I understand that. But otherwise, the class is much better when everybody is here. Everybody can ask questions. I can see from the look on your faces whether you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about or whether it's at the right level. So with that said, let's get started about what this course is about. How many people here have heard of the word emergence? Most of you have. How many people here think they know what it means? Okay, not yeah. Nobody's putting their hand up. I'll put my hand up, but even I'm not 100% sure. Well, I am actually. That's not quite true. But you'll learn about what it is, and also you'll learn why it's important. And I'm going to show you a very dramatic example of why it's important based on my own work in a few minutes' time. Okay, so what is this course about? This course is about things that are absolutely impossible. Okay, everything you know about physics up to now, unless you've had a course that is morally equivalent to this course, is about particles and how particles interact, like in classical mechanics, quantum mechanics, high energy physics, nuclear physics, and so on and so forth. The things that I'm going to tell you about in this class and teach you cannot be understood by anything that you've been taught so far. Okay, and I'm going to show you that. But on the other hand, what it is about, it answers the most interesting and fascinating questions in science. So I would claim that everything you've learned up to now is a prelude to the understanding that you will learn from this course, and which people like me who are professional scientists researching in this area use in our science, in our biology, in our physics, in our fluid mechanics, and understanding high energy physics, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very, very fundamental aspect of science, and it's sophisticated, and that's why you're only learning about it now. Okay, so what are the impossible things? So the first thing is that emergence, whatever that is, and we'll get into that in a little bit, emergence shouldn't happen. Okay, it's very easy to prove that any example of an emergent phenomenon that you might think of is impossible. I'll give you one example. We'll talk about it in detail in the class, the idea of a magnet. Okay, you all know what a magnet is. Okay, it's one of those things that you use to put your kids' pictures on the door of your refrigerator. Okay, that's what a magnet is. You can very simply prove that it's absolutely impossible that such a thing can exist. Okay, according to what you know and understand right now. So we're going to have to understand, how is it possible that the phenomenon of magnetism can occur? It literally should not. It shouldn't happen. There's other things that shouldn't happen. I'll show you some of those in a few minutes. So the phenomenon of emergence is itself something that is impossible. Breakdown of linear response theory. Let's be a bit more sophisticated. Okay, you've probably done some elementary statistical mechanics, you've done some solid state physics perhaps, so you know the idea of linear response theory. The idea of linear response theory is if I take a physical system and I perturb it, it changes in a way that is proportional at the lowest order to what I perturbed it with. If I apply an electric field to something, I will polarize it in a way that is proportional to the strength of the electric field. If I apply a magnetic field to a system, I may magnetize it temporarily by forcing the magnetic dipoles in the system to align with the external magnetic field. However strong that magnetic field is, the stronger will be the alignment of the magnetic dipoles in the material, and so on and so forth. If I push something, the harder I push it, the faster it will move. Things like that, linear response theory. Okay, that doesn't work. Okay, I'm going to show you that at phase transitions, that breaks down. It's one of the fundamental tenets of statistical mechanics, and that breaks down. Okay, when you do physics, you know that you can do some very simple problems like the harmonic oscillator, the hydrogen atom, particle in a box, a spring, things like this, right? Very simple things that are exactly solvable. Okay? If you then ask, well, in a real physical situation, how do I understand that problem? Well, if I just write it down, write down the equations of motion, write down the Schrödinger equation and things like that, I find that it's not possible to solve it exactly. So I have to use perturbation theory. How many people here have done perturbation theory in, say, elementary quantum mechanics or atomic physics? Pretty much everybody here. So you have some idea of this, okay? That's not going to work to try to understand the phenomena that we're going to be talking about today and in this course. So that goes straight out the window. That is the main tool that theoretical physicists have to solve problems in physics and not just in physics. That's not going to work either. Okay. How about dimensional analysis? How many people here know dimensional analysis? Are you all engineers? Yes? Yeah? All those people who put their hands up, are you engineers? Who here put their hands up and is a physicist? Okay, that's great. Okay, so you know what dimensional analysis is. Well, that's great, because the first homework set will be really easy for you then. Okay, dimensional analysis breaks down. Okay, so I'm using this word breaking down in a deliberately provocative way because I'll explain to you later in the course why what seems to be a breakdown isn't actually a breakdown. But what we're going to see is that when you have a phase transition, when a system becomes emergent, dimensional analysis breaks down and you can't use it. So that's like, wait, how can it possibly be? Everything I was taught about physics started off with dimensional analysis as the most basic thing. How can dimensional analysis be wrong? Well, we're going to find out. Okay, so that breaks down. Okay, here's another thing. Let's suppose I tell you that I'm going to do an experiment, and an experiment, a tabletop experiment. So here it is, it's sitting on here, and there's lots of lasers and microscopes and things like that. And I say to you, okay, well, let's try to write down by dimensional analysis, what are the things that should be important in trying to understand that experiment? So you might say, well, I should understand the charge on the particles, the wavelength of light, blah, blah, blah. And if I said to you, how about, well, we should look at the radius of the experiment itself, the size of the experiment, divided by the radius of the galaxy, okay, the Milky Way. You would say, well, you're an idiot. How can that possibly have anything to do with anything? That's basically zero, so we'll just ignore that, right? Okay, so that's the idea that anything is really small, you can neglect it, right? Right? Yep, you all know that, right, from dimensional analysis. Okay, wrong. Okay, it's not true. Okay, it doesn't work. Okay, in fact, that breaks down. That common sense behavior is not valid. Okay, at a phase transition, and in fact, this was so perplexing that when the problem of phase transitions was solved, and it was solved by three people, one of them got the Nobel Prize for that, Ken Wilson. That took about 50 years for people from the point where they could start to understand the definition of what a phase transition is and what the problem is, took about 50 years for people to understand it. And the biggest source of confusion in this whole thing was this idea that the small, so negligible idea from common sense breaks down. And if it breaks down, then what replaces it? How do you get around that? It's fantastic how this gets resolved, and it's a very exciting intellectual story, and you'll learn about it. Okay, here's another thing that's impossible. I can show you that I can make predictions about experiments, and those predictions get verified routinely, and the starting point for that is a model that is completely wrong. Okay, you'll say, that's your description of a superconductor. Are you kidding me? And yet, bang, here's the data. And look, it falls exactly on the theoretical curve. I'm going to show you an example of this in a few minutes. Okay, so you can make predictions which are absolutely precise from obviously wrong starting points. And if you believe that, then that says that when somebody tells you, hey, we have the standard model of particle physics, and that is the most accurate theory in physics, and we can predict things to 10 significant figures and verify them experimentally, and so therefore we understand the standard model of high-energy physics. Once you know that what is on the board there, precise predictions from obviously wrong starting points, you'll then realize that that claim is probably completely wrong. And in fact, one of the reasons why there's a course on this, why I teach such a course, is because when the problem of phase transitions and emergence was worked out, it wasn't just like, oh, okay, so there's some new theory and somebody did a calculation and got the Nobel Prize. It's like, oh, wow, this completely changes the way we think about physics. It completely changed it. So the whole way that we think about particle physics, high energy physics, completely revolutionized by what happened in condensed matter physics. All of these things totally change the way we understand physics, and that's why this course is so important. It's not so important just because, well, we want to understand a phase transition. Phase transitions are nice because when it snows, that's a phase transition. Oh yeah, it doesn't snow here. Okay, well, in my previous place it used to snow. Okay, so it is a fundamental course. It's not just about a very narrow set of predictions. Okay. So let's ask the who cares question. Okay, that's always the question you should ask when anybody is trying to sell you some physics. Who cares? So let's have a look at this. Let me give you an example. So I'm just going to give you several examples. Like there's a million that I could give you, but let's just talk about this one. Okay, you should care about this. This is the phase diagram of life. Okay, so one of the things I work on is evolutionary biology, and some of you will know what this thing is here. How many people have seen this before? Yes. What is it?
Which phase?
This
Last common ancestor.
This is the last universal common ancestor. And what are these?
Three branches.
The three branches of life, or the three domains of life. So what we think is that you all know what bacteria are. You know what eukaryotes are. Okay, you're a physicist, so it's okay to say no. Okay, eukaryotes are supposedly cells that have a nucleus. So we're all eukaryotes, mesozoans, there's plants, animals, and so on. We're eukaryotes. And then how many people here have heard of these things? Archaea? Maybe one. Okay. All right. Most people haven't. Okay. So what are archaea? Well, when you look at a bacterium through a microscope, they typically look like round blobby things that you can just about see in a microscope. If you look at archaea through a microscope, they also mostly look like round blobby things. Okay. But their evolutionary history is completely different from that of bacteria. And they were discovered by a friend of mine, Carl Woese, who was my mentor in biology. It was when I started doing biology 25 years ago. He discovered these, and he discovered it by molecular sequencing, the forerunner of today's genomics. So this is the family tree of life. You're used to the idea of a family tree, right? You give your genes to your kids, they give their genes to their kids, to your grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Okay, and you get a tree. Okay, So that's the idea. And this thing here is the last universal common ancestor, which is the organism or the group of organisms from which all life on Earth is descended. And we know that such a thing existed, and we can even construct the genes that that organism had. Okay? Now, here's the funny thing. If you look at this timeline, this here says 3.8 billion years. Okay? So this is time going up. So this last universal common ancestor was 3.8 billion years ago. Okay, how old is the planet? How old is the Earth? 4.6 billion years, right? Okay, so you've got 4.6 billion years, and I'm standing up here, not grinning. Well, I'm going to grin now, of course, but not grinning and telling you that life started less than 1 billion years after the planet was actually formed. Okay, who would believe that? It sounds crazy, right? How could it? I mean, it took last universal common ancestor was a kind of blobby thing, right? Like a bacterium or an archaea or something, and yet here we are, 3.8 billion years later, and we've got humans and elephants and things like this. But everything that we have in our cells was already there at this last universal common ancestor, and that was less than 1 billion years after the planet started. So how did it go so fast to get from nothing to the modern cell? And then this period over 3.8 billion years, there was evolution for sure, but nothing very dramatic. Nothing as equivalent as going from 0 to 60 in 3.8 billion years, in 0.8 billion years. So what went before that? This is called the last universal common ancestor, implying that there were earlier common ancestors, and there were. And what we know, we believe it to be true, and we have evidence, very good evidence for this, is that there was a period of time where life underwent a period of rapid evolution. And you can see here, this thing is meant to be a network. That's what this cartoon is. This is a network, and it's a network because genes, instead of being transmitted to your children, the genes are transmitted to people who are not related to you. So for example, let's suppose there was a gene for doing Feynman diagrams in the normalization group in physics. There isn't such a gene, but let's pretend that there were. Okay, so we would have two choices then. You could either take this course for the next 20 lectures and learn how to do those calculations and why you're doing them and all of that, or I could just throw out the gene and you could just grab it, put it in your cells, and bang, you would suddenly know how to do Feynman diagrams for the normalization group in 4 minus epsilon dimensions and so on. Okay, now we can't do that, but bacteria can. And archaea can, and actually eukaryotes can do something like that as well. So what happened in this phase of life was that organisms exchanged genes, not just simple genes like doing Feynman diagram genes, but genes that actually control the behavior of the translation and transcription machinery, the replication machinery in every cell in your body. And that's how life evolved so rapidly. It evolved through a network effect. And I'm not going to tell you about the theory that we developed on this and how it was done and how it was verified and so on, but this is a phase transition between a period of rapid evolution and a period of slow evolution. Okay, question. Anybody here a cosmologist? Anybody here doing astrophysics or cosmology? No? Okay. So too bad. Okay. Something like this happened in cosmology too. Anybody know why? Why do I think that? Say it again? Inflation, exactly right. The universe has a very strange puzzle. The Big Bang started, and then the universe inflated for a process that is still being explored, and then underwent a period of slow expansion that is almost stopped, but then is moving because of dark energy and so on. But that rapid expansion was called inflation, an exponential growth of the scale factor in general relativity, very similar to what's happening here. So these sorts of transitions, dynamic transitions, happen in a lot of different problems. All right, here's another one. Okay, we're talking about phase transitions. So here you are. This may be the most important course you will ever take. Why? I'm going to see if I can move this thing. Why can't I move this thing? There we go. Why? Well, because we have climate change. And one wants to know if the climate is going to change, and there literally is a tipping point, a phase transition in climate, desertification, for example. You'd want to know ahead of time that what you see as a lush forest around you is suddenly going to turn into a desert, and people will start to emigrate and so on. And that process, as you know, is starting to happen. So people are very interested to understand early warning signals of phase transitions in climate systems. Okay. So great. My computer froze. Why? All right. Well, okay, now it's working. All right, so let's talk about complex systems then. So what are complex systems? Okay, obviously we're talking about systems that are not just a particle being thrown, a tennis ball being thrown by somebody. We're talking about systems that are more complicated than that. So the statistical systems, they have strong fluctuations. That means that the average behavior is not what is happening to the system as a whole. So the fluctuations are strong. It can have unpredictable and nonlinear dynamics. For example, turbulence. Fluid turbulence is unpredictable, it's nonlinear, it's a problem that I work on, it's a very frontier, exciting problem in science. Complex systems have multiple scales of space and time, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the class. They have emergent structure, and that's what we're going to talk about. And they often have active components. For example, you might want to understand, how did life emerge? Well, it has active components which somehow self-organize, form structures that are hierarchically nested, and then have feedback loops between them. And that is how the complexity of, say, living organisms operates. So we have a sort of physical complexity, biological complexity. You can think of the brain as being an example of this. And you can think of, say, things like turbulence, chaotic dynamics, and so on as being examples of those things. So why do we study complex systems now in the 21st century? Well, in the development of the sciences, you pick the low-hanging fruit first. So the easy stuff was done by Newton, and Lagrange, and Hamilton, and so on and so forth, and Schrödinger. And for those things, the reductionist approach is valid. You can just say, well, stuff is just made of particles. If we're going to understand anything, we should understand what happens when I throw a ball. If I understand what happens when I throw a ball, I understand why the moon goes around the Earth, or why the Earth goes around the sun, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, you encounter problems where you have strong interactions, and that leads to emergent phenomena. And then from emergent phenomena, you can also get a complex behavior as well. So that's why we want to understand these things, because we kind of used up all the phenomena that we think of as being susceptible to a reductionist way of thinking. But in fact, there was a big surprise, because what we discovered was when we understood about emergence and collective phenomena and so on, what we understood that even simple problems where you think they're reductionist and can be understood very simply cannot. So there's a joke that says in classical mechanics, the three-body problem is insoluble. Okay, you know what the three-body problem is? Three particles, like say gravitating, what happens? There's even a science fiction book, and a very good book, by the way, in the science fiction series called The Three-Body Problem. Okay, so the three-body problem, it has no exact solution, and that's well understood. Then the joke says that in quantum mechanics, the two-body problem is unsolvable, because just solving problems in quantum mechanics is already really, really hard for graduate students and physicists to do. And then you do a quantum field theory, the next level. And in quantum field theory, the one-body problem becomes insoluble. But you can't even solve that. In fact, it's even worse than that. The zero-body problem becomes insoluble. Even the vacuum is now too complicated to understand without worrying about strong interactions and emergent phenomena. And so as we've encountered more and more interesting problems, we've looked back on the things that we thought we understood and realized we didn't really understand them properly. Okay, so let's talk about emergence. And I'm going to show you a very, very amazing experiment. I guarantee it is the most amazing experiment that you have probably ever seen. So why don't you, those of you at the back, why don't you come over here? So I want you to see this experiment, because I'm going to show you something that you may not have seen before. So I want to make sure nobody misses it. You guys over there, you should come over here too. Right. Well, come here, I won't bite. Well, sometimes I'm right. Okay. All right. So let's first of all do this experiment. Okay, everybody's got a finger. All right, forefinger, everybody. Yep. All right. Our goal is to lift the ceiling. Okay, see the ceiling up there? I want us to try and lift it. So let's push really hard. Come on, come on. It's a bit more effort. Come on. Right. Has anybody moved the ceiling? Anybody feel any resistance? Nothing? Nothing at all? Yeah, you're right. Nothing. Okay. So that didn't work. Okay. I'm now going to show you something truly amazing. I'm going to take the same finger that couldn't lift the ceiling, and I'm going to move this eraser with my finger. And watch very carefully. Look at that. Look at that. See it? Let's do it again. Don't miss it. Okay. I'm going to try just to make sure I didn't have something up my sleeve. Definitely different, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So you may say, "Well, come on, this is ridiculous. What's the big deal? Of course it moved, right?" But here's the thing. Let's think about this as physicists. Okay. We tried to move the ceiling. We're in a room full of air. The air is a fluid. Okay. What is the Hamiltonian of a fluid? I'll write it down. What is the Hamiltonian of the fluid? So here's the Hamiltonian. It is kinetic energy plus potential energy, right? So it's squared with 2m. That's the kinetic energy, and then the potential energy is the sum of the particles, and then the interactions between the particles. Right? So something like that. Okay, that's the Hamiltonian for the fluid. What's the Hamiltonian for the solid? For this board eraser? It's the same. It's exactly the same. And yet, this didn't work, and this did. So somehow, the atoms in this, governed by exactly the same equation, they all conspire that when I push the atom here at this end, all of the atoms are going to just move along with it. Okay, they conspire to do that. Without me telling them to, they just spontaneously decided, right, well, if I'm going to move that atom, then I'm going to move along with that atom, and the atom over here says to me, I'm going to move along with you, and so on and so forth. And 10 to the 23 atoms all move together. It's a conspiracy, an atomic conspiracy. And yet, this happens and this works. Okay, why aren't you falling through the floor? Anybody worried about falling through the floor? Have you ever looked through the floor? You know what an atom is, right? The floor is made out of atoms. Here's a picture of an atom. There's a nucleus, and then, I don't know, further away than I can reach, there's maybe a few electrons. Okay, it's mostly empty space. How come you didn't fall through it? Okay, we don't understand it, right? So we're going to have to, so this is something that is emergent. What's happened here? Well, I'm going to show you. Let's talk about this. So go and sit down. Let's now analyze what you just saw with your own eyes. Okay, so this is what I just showed you. I just showed you fluid, atoms, particles bouncing around in a box, and a low temperature the crystalline solid forms, and it has characteristics that are different from the fluid state. So if you go to a solid state physics class, they'll tell you that if I take a bunch of atoms in a box and cool them down, what's going to happen? You already answered the question. Somebody else. The answer's on the screen. Say it again.
Periodicity.
Form a periodic crystal. Yes, form a periodic crystal lattice. Well, do you think this thing is a periodic crystal lattice? If I look at it through a microscope,
Yeah.
You do? I'm pretty sure it isn't. It's a bunch of polymers which are disordered and cross-linked and form some weird composite material. I'm pretty sure it's not crystalline. Okay? Now, it is true that if you take atoms which are round, blobby things, very simple atoms, and lower the temperature, they will form crystals. And then all the things that you teach you in solid state physics will apply. Okay, and you can do those things. But that in general, what they teach you is very simple properties of solids that come from the fact that they have atoms in a crystalline array. But this is the This is the Hamiltonian of the stuff, and it doesn't have to be periodic. So what happens is something forms a solid. And how do I know something is solid? Well, it resists a shear. Like this thing here, I can't bend it. I can deform this part here, but then it bounces back. I can push it and it will move along. So we really can say that if I want to think about what is a solid, and I don't have to be, I can be agnostic about whether it is a crystal or not, or if it's a disordered solid material like the eraser, what I would say is that it has a static shear rigidity. If I try to shear a fluid by, say, putting my finger up and doing this, I'm trying to shear the air, doesn't work, can't do it. If I try to shear a material, it pushes back, it has a shear rigidity. So there's something different about the solid state than there is about the fluid state. So why is this interesting? As we discussed a few minutes ago, the underlying physics of the crystal is exactly the same as the fluid. The total energy is just the kinetic energy plus the potential energy. Lowering the temperature has not changed the interactions between the atoms, but something else has happened. So the conclusion is, although the pairwise interactions between atoms did not change, the correlations between them changed when the temperature was lowered. The correlations, not the interactions. Correlations meaning, if I know I've got an atom here, what is the probability that I will see another atom over here? That's called a correlation, and that has changed. That's very different in air and fluid than it is in the solid state, but the interactions didn't. So this is all going to be about trying to understand correlations. And the solid state emerged as if by magic out of the fluid state. I mean, we didn't predict that it would occur. It's just we lower the temperature and bang, you suddenly see that there are solids and you don't fall through the floor. Now, here's the thing. This is why this is a really big deal. Okay, the solid state has its own new laws of physics. Okay, let's say it again. The solid state has its own new laws of physics. I am going to claim that the laws of physics in the solid state are different from the laws of physics in the fluid state. In fact, if I was in an engineering department, they'd say, well, of course, you have fluid mechanics people over here and solid mechanics people over here. The solid mechanics people build bridges. The fluid mechanics people design airplanes and things like this. And let's have a look at what those new laws of physics are. Well, here they are. There's the picture that you'll see in the solid state physics textbook, a bunch of atoms in a crystalline array joined by springs. Okay, how many people here have done a course on solid state physics? About half of you. Okay, so you've done the phonons. You've looked at the excitation, what happens when you have lattice vibrations and you see phonons. Okay, and when you write down a Hamiltonian for that, you wrote down a Hamiltonian of a bunch of particles in periodic array joined by springs. Right? Right? Yeah. Okay, so these springs mean that there are new long-range forces that are completely distinct from the original forces between the atoms. This potential here, I drew on the blackboard, I didn't say what it is, but it's usually, excuse me, it's usually a short-range potential. The elastic forces are long-range. Okay, the further you pull things, the stronger it gets. Okay, so that phenomenon is what is known as elasticity. And the response of the solid to an external disturbance is completely different from that of a fluid, as we saw in the experiment that we did. Did you have a question?
I'll save it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, but if you do have a question, please ask. So if I ask you, what is emergent about this picture? The answer is the springs are emergent. The springs are emergent. And the origin of these new laws, this elasticity, the laws of springs, is a collective statistical behavior of the atoms as verified by looking at their correlations. So if you want to say in a nutshell, what are we trying to predict? We would like to be able to predict what is the spring constant of those springs. A, that those springs exist, and B, what is the spring constant? Okay, so when I say the solid state has its own new laws of physics, you might say, well, you know, the professor's really lost it. He's completely crazy. The laws of physics are just the standard model of particle physics. But no, not really, because at the level of description of a solid, the actual interactions between atoms cannot be detected. Okay, so if I'm just measuring solids, I'm in the 19th century, and I'm one of these people who's bending beams and trying to work out elasticity theory and starting the whole discipline of engineering, I didn't even know that atoms existed then. All I knew was how to describe things by understanding the elasticity theory, the continuum mechanics. The only thing you can observe when you look at a solid like this is the continuum mechanics. You have to work a lot harder to be able to see the atoms and then figure out how they interact and so on. So at the level of description of a solid, the actual interactions cannot be detected. All you see are the emergent interactions. And I've used the term level of description. I put it in colors because it's a really important term. One of the things that physicists learned about studying phase transitions, studying emergence, was actually nature has multiple levels of description. And the most important question a scientist can ask is, if I'm trying to understand a phenomenon, what is the right level of description that I should be using? And if I use the wrong level of description, I will not be able to solve the problem. Case in point, superconductivity. Superconductivity is the idea, is the phenomenon that I can have perpetual motion. I can have a current going around a loop in a material that is superconducting, and that current will last forever and never decay. Now, if you try to set that up, just in your, at home, you'll make a current, and what will happen is the wire will get hot and it will glow, and eventually the battery will run down. Okay, a superconducting current, a supercurrent, will just keep going forever, literally forever. Okay, so this phenomenon of superconductivity was discovered about 100 years ago. And everybody tried to understand it. Einstein, Feynman, Landau, everybody. Okay, all Schrödinger, all the famous. Actually, I don't know if Schrödinger did, but probably everybody tried to understand this problem. It took 50 years to understand it. It was understood finally by Bardeen, Cooper, and Schrieffer at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which is where I used to be a professor, and so I moved here 4.5 years ago. And John Bardeen. How many people have heard of John Bardeen's name? A couple of you, all right? How did you hear his name? We've really done a bit of BCS theory. Yeah. Anybody heard of his name not in connection with BCS theory? Transistors, yes. John Bardeen won twice as many Nobel Prizes as Albert Einstein. Okay, he got the theory of superconductivity Nobel Prize, and he also invented the transistor. So he was one of the professors at Illinois when I first moved there. An amazing person. Okay, so level of description is important. He figured out the right level of description to use. You're not going to get this by thinking about individual atoms and so on. Landau, the Ginzburg and Landau. How many people have heard of Ginzburg-Landau theory? Right, Ginzburg and Landau, they also got the Nobel Prize for superfluidity and for superfluidity and superconductivity. In the case of Ginzburg, Ginzburg's name will come up in this course, and they also understood another level of description, perhaps a better level of description than the effective theory that BCS are used. So the levels of description turns out to be the most important thing, and physicists are very, very passionate about trying to understand what is the right level of description for a problem. I work on the problem of turbulence. Okay, fluid turbulence has been a problem since 1883, when it was first investigated scientifically by Osborne Reynolds. It is still unsolved, but I would claim that we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years, some of which I've participated in. And the reason we've made the progress is because we looked at the problem at a different level of description than what the fluid mechanicians had been used to do. And we've made predictions that could not have been made previously, and they've been tested experimentally. And so if we have time in this course, I will tell you a little bit about that towards the end. Okay, emergence is new laws of physics. Okay, this is why it took so long for the existence of atoms to be deduced. Because if you're doing experiments on a solid and all you see are balls and springs, and you don't really see the real atomic interactions, you don't even know atoms exist, well, then it's hard for you to find them. So where do atoms and their interactions matter? Of course they do matter. Where? Well, as I said before, if I want to know the spring constant here, what I would have to do is start off with the real Hamiltonian for the, quote, real atoms, and then do some complicated calculation, which, who knows how to do that, and then be able to predict the elastic response of the material. And we can do something like that, but nobody really cares about that. The engineering solid mechanics people were perfectly fine saying, well, we have the solid modulus with the shear modulus with the Lamy coefficients, Poisson's ratio, blah, blah, blah. Here are these various elastic constants. And then once you know what those are, then you can then go ahead and predict the properties of materials. And that's the thing that you spend all your time doing. So those things in principle can be computed from the atomic level of description, but you don't really need to know them. They're just a few phenomenological parameters that you put into your equations. So let me give you an example of this because you've been doing this all your life. So how many people here are doing experiments, say, on atomic physics or quantum mechanics or something? Anybody doing research yet? Okay, a few of you. Okay, those of you who are doing research, okay, do you ever have to take the radiative corrections to the mass of the top quark into account in your experiments or your theory? You don't, right? You just say, well, okay, I need to know the mass of this thing. It's n times the mass of the hydrogen atom or something like that. And what is the mass of the hydrogen atom? Well, it's just whatever it is. Okay, so you don't ask where that comes from. You just say that's a parameter that describes matter, and then you just move on. So we're used to doing this, and in fact, suppose it were the case that in order to understand anything simple, the sort of things that you are doing in your research or will do in your research, and in order to do that, you had to understand everything all the way down. You had to understand the mass of the top quark. You had to understand quantum chromodynamics. You had to understand grand unified theories. You had to understand superstring theory. Well, then you would never be able to do anything. Okay, so the fact that there are different levels of description and they're separated from each other and protected by a few phenomenological parameters like the shear modulus of the material or the mass of the hydrogen atom, that's the thing that enables you to do science in the first place. There's fields of activity, of intellectual activity, where such a separation doesn't exist. Anybody want to name one? Think of a field of activity which is studied in this university, every university, and it doesn't make much progress. In fact, the one I'm thinking of calls itself the dismal science. And the reason, anybody know what that's a hint, anybody know what I'm talking about? No, not social science. No.
Big politics.
Politics.
Science.
No, well, you're close. You're both close. Economics. Economics is sometimes called the dismal science. I think it was Keynes, so somebody who was qualified to make that statement. Why? Because there's no obvious simplification in different levels of description that one can simplify and say, okay, well, there's the atoms and here's the elastic theory and here's the superconducting theory and stuff like that. There's no obvious way to do that. There's macroeconomics and microeconomics, but they're so strongly coupled that it's hard to separate them and so on. So that's why it's very hard to make progress. The reason that we're able to make so much progress in physical sciences is because our problems are really easy, not because we're smarter than other scientists. Okay, so what have I told you? I've told you that emergence always leads to some form of rigidity. Well, I showed you an example of this, but in general, when people ask you, well, what is emergence? You'll say, well, there's going to be some new kind of rigidity that comes out, and that generalized rigidity describes the response to perturbations. So I'm trying to perturb the fluid, nothing happened. Here I perturb the solid, something happened. So the hallmark of emergence is that I see some sort of rigidity. Now the rigidity here is the thing that corresponds to your everyday notion of what something rigid is. But if I talk about, say, a superconductor, which has a current that will last forever, a persistent current, that happens through a thing called the rigidity of the wave function, a quantum kind of rigidity. And all of the phenomena that I know of, where there's something emergent, there's some characteristic which is the analog in that very different system to the rigidity that you see in that simple thing. For example, in ecology, people want to understand an ecosystem. We want to understand how stable it is. We want to understand, is it going to be destroyed by fluctuations in the climate and so on. And that's called resilience. We want to understand the resilience of an ecosystem. We want to understand the resilience of human beings to high temperatures or drugs or diseases and things like that. All right. So what I've told you is that there's emergent levels of description. They absorb the properties of lower levels of description into phenomenological parameters. And if it's going to be useful, those have to be a small number of parameters. This makes fundamental physics hard because one goes against the flow of emergence. So let's think about what I told you. I've told you that what happens at the macroscopic level doesn't really depend, in some sense, and needs to be made quantitative, doesn't depend too sensitively on what the structure of matter is at a smaller scale, at a lower level of description. So if that's true, then if I want to understand what is going on at those small scales, it's very, very hard to do an experiment to detect those things, because all the things that I see at the macroscopic level don't really depend on what's happening at the microscopic level. I can describe for you perfectly well superconductivity without ever talking about what kind of material I'm using. How many people here have done statistical mechanics? All of you. Good. You all know the ideal gas law, right? PV equals NKT, right? Okay. Which gas does that apply to? Okay, gases are ideal, but which particular one? Where is there something in that formula that says, oh, this is the mass of the hydrogen atom, this is the mass of the nitrogen atom, this is the mass of the xenon? Nothing, right? So that's an example of something that is universal. It describes all the properties of a gas, and you've been using it all your life. But which gas? All of them. So now I've learned nothing at all about the actual structure of the things that make up a gas. I've just learned about its response. So that's an example of this. So knowing the ideal gas law tells you nothing about atoms. That's why the ideal gas law was discovered several centuries before we understood the existence of atoms. And so the fact that fundamental physics is hard because it goes against the flow of emergence dooms reductionism. And of course, reductionism is doomed in any case, because I say to you, well, the world is made up of atoms. Atoms are the indivisible building blocks of nature. That's what chemists told us in the 19th century. And then it turned out to be, oops, well, actually, hold that thought. That's not quite true. Atoms actually have in them protons and neutrons and electrons, but then now we've got it sorted out, and that's physical chemistry sorted out for you. And then it's like, wait, but if we just go and use a better microscope, which means go to higher energy, which means look at smaller wavelengths. So we build an accelerator and we start looking inside those particles. We say, oh, well, never mind that. There's these things called mesons. And how many of those are there? There's hundreds of them. And there's quarks and blah, 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 blah. And you keep on going. So collective properties of matter should be understood and can be understood without having the knowledge all the way down. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to learn in this class is some questions are questions you shouldn't ask, at least not if you want to stay a physicist. Okay, so if you want to ask me, can you tell me about high temperature superconductors? I can tell you a lot about high temperature superconductors. I did a lot of work on high temperature superconductors many years ago at the beginning of the field. If you ask me, why does yttrium barium copper oxide have a transition temperature of 93.5 Kelvin? I have absolutely no idea. Okay, so there's some questions I can tell you the answers to them pretty well, and even discover things and which people didn't know before. And there's other questions you can ask where it's like, that's too complicated. We don't know how to answer that question. It may not have a simple answer. Okay, so emergence is associated with loss of uniqueness. So when we talk about this thing, this is a solid, but it could equally well be in the fluid state. It's just that it happens not to be. Okay, so I can take a fluid, a gas, I can supercool it below the melting temperature, and it will still stay gas. So one of the hallmarks of emergence is loss of uniqueness. Things can be in either one of two possible states, but one state is much more likely than the other. So that's one of the things we're going to learn. We're going to learn that phase transitions separate these different states, and they are collective phenomena only well defined for thermodynamically large systems. Why that's the case and what that means, we'll get into that later. So new collective properties arise in emergent states. I've given examples here: crystals, magnets, superconductors, quantum Hall effect. I didn't mention that before. I mentioned turbulence, gravity. Is gravity an emergent phenomenon? Okay, is life an emergent phenomenon? Well, for sure, life is an emergent phenomenon. Somehow matter just began to self-assemble and create molecules that then became living. So that's an emergent phenomena. So we have to understand those things. Okay, so this field that we're engaged in was, it reached a landmark point watershed point in about 1972 with this paper by Phil Anderson. Phil Anderson was a solid-state physicist. He won the Nobel Prize for his work on disordered materials. He probably could have won several more Nobel Prizes, or at least one. He also invented the Higgs boson, which you probably may not have known, and he was the kinetic amount of physicists will call the Higgs boson the Anderson Higgs boson. It comes out in the same way that it does in particle physics, but it comes out in superconductivity. And he even understood that it applies to Yang-Mills theories and wrote a wonderful paper on that in 1962, April 1st, 1962, Physical Review on plasmons, what's it called? Plasmons gauge of variance in mass. Okay, he understood the Higgs mechanism, didn't understand it fully quantum mechanically. That was left for Higgs and others to do. But so he was an amazing scientist, and he understood in a very deep way the idea of what is now called a spontaneously broken symmetry, which is, if you've heard about the Higgs boson, you'll have heard about spontaneously broken symmetry. All started off in kinetic amount of physics, and he wrote an essay called "More is Different: Broken Symmetry and the Nature of the Hierarchical Structure of Science." So I want to give you an example of more is different. Why did he say more is different? I'm going to show you an example from my own work with one of my own current graduate students here at UCSD, work that is not even published yet. So I want to just tell you about that. I'm going to tell you about emergence in machine learning. Okay, so I want to just explain to you a little bit about machine learning. Not everything, and I'm just going to show you how that even these things apply in machine learning. Okay, so let's talk about this. I'm going to talk about the idea that I'm building machine learning, I'm building AI like ChatGPT and Gemini and all these things, these amazing machines that we can now develop. And what is amazing about them is this, that as you increase the capacity of the network, when you give them things to do, they can do them surprisingly well. Okay, so here I've got a definition for you. A capacity is a model's ability to fit a wide variety of functions or patterns in data. So what that really means is when I draw in the next few graphs, the horizontal axis here being capacity of a neural network, what I mean is basically the number of parameters in the model. So somebody will say to you, oh yeah, we've got ChatGPT, it's got 5 trillion parameters or whatever it is now, okay? And you kind of know that the more parameters it has, the better it's going to be able to answer questions and things like that. We kind of know that, but why? Why is that true? Okay, did you ever ask yourself that? So let me show you that that idea is completely wrong, okay? Or at least very suspect. So let's have a look. So what I'm plotting on this graph is the error that a neural network makes when it fits data and when it answers questions. In other words, it does generalization. So there's two types of error. There's training error, how well it can fit training data. And there's test error, which is if you then give it a test and say, here's a question, can you do this for me? How well it does that. And let's just suppose that we've got technical ways to define those things, which we do, and I'm not going to go into that. Okay, so let's suppose that here's our task. Let's suppose I've got a bunch of data points like this, and I'm supposed to try to predict, what's going to happen at the later times. Okay, so there's my data. So you might say, okay, here's a very simple theory. Here's a line that goes through these data, and I can use that line to predict the behavior. Well, you can see that this theory, this solid line, is a theory with a lot of bias. What I mean by bias, well, it doesn't properly fit the data. So I've biased it by saying it's just going to be a straight line. So that is this curve here. And you can see that there's bits of this curve, bits of these data, which do kind of look like a straight line. So it doesn't behave too badly, but there's other parts where it's obviously really, really bad. So we can say that this line doesn't even fit these data properly, let alone enable you to predict what the next thing is going to be. Okay, so then you say, okay, fine, that's a stupid theory. Let's now make a theory. We're going to fit it not by a line, but by a 100th order polynomial. Okay, a 100th order polynomial. So here's my 100th order polynomial shown here on the right. And you'd say, well, that must be good now. I've got 100 parameters. I've made everything really good. I've got a 100th order polynomial fitting these data points. But the trouble is this, those data points have got noise associated to them. And so all I've done by making a 100th order polynomial is I fitted the noise. So do you think I'll be able to make good predictions if my predictions is biased by the noise? Of course not. Okay, so what I've just shown you is that in the underfitting regime, the theory doesn't really make a very good effort to fit the data, and I might have very little training error because I fitted all the data points. So you say, well, I did a good job of that. So the training error is 0. But then if you ask it to make predictions, it gives really bad predictions, as bad as this theory would do for over here, the linear fit. So somewhere in the middle, you could say, well, you're a bit of an idiot. Why you use a 100th order polynomial? Why don't you just use, say, I don't know, a 5th order polynomial? So you do something like this. So here's a polynomial which is quite reasonable. And now you can see it has got a good balance between this bias case and this high variance case. And it reasonably fits the data points. And if you were to extrapolate this curve, it probably wouldn't do a bad job in extrapolating that. So that's about the best job that you can do, and that's sort of over here. And there's some sweet spot. It could be a 5th order polynomial or 6th order or 7th order, but some number of coefficients will be a really, really good fit. Okay, so that's the sweet spot. Okay, so that is the idea. So now you can see that there's something very strange about this, because this says as I increase the number of parameters, my test error, how well it can make predictions, is getting bigger. So it's getting worse. But yet you read in the newspapers that OpenAI and Google and so on are spending billions and billions of dollars to get more and more parameters into their models to make it work better. So what's going on? Okay, so what I've told you then is that when you are underfitting, you've got too simple a theory to capture the training data complexities. And when you're overfitting, you've got a good fit to noisy training data, but there's a high test error. So we haven't understood anything about the problem. Okay, so what we learned, and we learned this only in the last less than 10 years, maybe 5 or 6 years. Here I've quoted a paper by Misha Belkin over here in the computer science department, but there's others around that time. So what people understood was that when you over-parameterize, when you have more parameters than there are data points, there's over-parameterization, then it's possible for the test error to actually reduce as a function of the number of parameters. So there's a point here called the interpolation threshold, which is the threshold from under-parameterized to over-parameterized. And that under-parameterization, that's a phase that lacks sufficient complexity. Over-parameterization has more parameters than necessary. It interpolates the data points exactly, so you should be fitting noise, but in fact, when you do generalization, it actually works. How is that possible? Okay, so let's talk about that. So this problem is called double descent, and so this is the first descent curve. This is the second descent curve over here. That's what it's called in computer science. I think Misha Belkin may have come up with a name. So there's a mystery. How do you understand the fact that if I look at the test error, as I go towards this point here, that goes up. And in fact, you can show that it actually goes to infinity. Okay, yeah, it is in fact true. The more and more parameters you put in, the classical networks are doing worse and worse. I mean, infinitely badly. Okay, but then it starts to come back down again. So you want to understand, why does the test error diverge here? And the answer is that this is actually a phase transition. It literally is a phase transition in the sense I'm going to teach you in this class. Okay, and I'm not going to show you the theory for that, but it's a phase transition. And then there's a second question. So that's the first thing, why there's a phase transition here. The second thing is, why is it that as I put more and more parameters into the model, the test error goes down? People call that benign overfitting. I'm overfitting the data, and yet it is somehow working better in generalization. And that is, in fact, a new phase with emergent parameters and a rigidity. And that rigidity is the thing that gives rise to the good generalization performance. So what is the connection between these things? What it has to do with this course? At the end of this course, if I have time, I'll show you what the connection is. Okay, but to understand it is very sophisticated. Okay, our paper on this is still in review in Physical Review Letters. It's going to be accepted. In fact, pretty sure we had the first referee's reports back and they're good and so on. The thing that we discovered is that this phase transition here is like the superconducting transition. And this emergent rigidity is exactly the thing that is like the thing that gives you the persistent current in a superconductor. It is absolutely amazing. It is absolutely incredible. Nobody noticed this before. Why? Because they weren't looking at this problem from the point of view of statistical mechanics. People understood that these are statistical things. You have stochastic gradient descent and so on and so forth. But people hadn't tried to think about this from the point of view of condensed matter physics and so on. And that's what we were able to do. And so we can actually understand why this phenomenon occurs. Okay, so that's an example of how the ideas in this course apply in areas where you would not really expect to apply. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about emergence and complexity. This is just a bit of propaganda. So you might say, well, when do you get complex systems? So you might say, well, let's look at what we teach here in the physics department. There's atomic physics, then condensed matter physics, solid state physics, and maybe there's a really great biophysics group here, which I'm a member of. People can study cell biology, biofilms, multicellularity. You can study ecosystems, community structure, social systems, economic systems. These are meant to be sort of going on here to the right, but I don't have any more room to put them in. So those are the sort of different layers of complexity that you can see in phenomena in science. And you might say, well, if I want to understand where do I see emergence, well, obviously not at atomic physics, but once I put the atoms together, then I start getting emergent properties, and ultimately I get complex systems. So complexity, you might say, well, complexity is like when you're looking at biology, neuroscience, and so on and so forth. So emergence begins with strongly interacting condensed matter, or does it? Well, let's go back the other way and let's have a look at atomic physics. So we look at atomic physics. So there it is now in the center of the screen, and there's condensed matter physics and biology falling off the end here. But now I have to look at nuclear physics. I have to look at quarks and gluons and so on. And in fact, all of these things are very, very influenced and very have to be understood from the point of view of their emergent properties. When you understand the theory of QCD, it's like I'm trying to understand in a more complicated way the theory of superconductivity. So all of these things are dominated by collective behavior. And then you say, well, okay, how about strings? Okay, string theory. Well, let's talk about string theory. Remember I told you that one of the hallmarks of emergence is that you can have multiple states. Like I could take a gas and I could cool it down and it could turn into a solid, say like my solid over here, but it could also just stay liquid for a while and then eventually would undergo a transition to becoming a solid. Okay, so multiple states is a hallmark of emergent phenomena. The string theory vacuum has got 10 to the 500 different states. Okay, it's not fundamental at all. Okay, it's also emergent. Okay, so there's emergence at every level of descriptions, and so to understand physics, you have to understand emergence. All right, misconceptions about emergence. So some people will tell you that emergence is a phenomenon that is surprising and unpredictable. And I've given you some example shown here. I don't think that is correct. Just because you can't predict something or it's surprising doesn't mean that you can't have a theory of it. I showed you a theory of the surprising, unpredictable behavior of neural networks and showed you that actually you can, if you know how to do the calculation, predict that. So there's many statistical mechanics techniques to predict emergence in physical and biological systems, and the subjective difficulty of a calculation is certainly not a part of the definition. Okay, some people say, oh, emergence, I know what that is. It's the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, you've all heard that phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It means I have a bunch of particles or a bunch of stuff inside, but the whole thing behaves more than what the things do individually. That's not really true. It's not really true. Because if I take a look at, say, a bunch of particles bouncing around in a box, the ideal gas, the energy of that system is the sum of the energies of the particles in the box. That's true. If they're interacting, then the energy is not the sum of the energy of the individual particles. There's these correlations between the interactions and so on. So the energy is not necessarily that, but you don't necessarily have to have emergence. You can have emergence. You can have the whole is greater than the sum of its parts coming from interactions without there being emergence. So as an example, the ideal gas equation of state. How many people here know about the van der Waals equation of state? You've heard of that. You did that in the stat met class. It's a bit more complicated. It has some slightly more adjustable parameters in it. It's a better description of real gases, but it still doesn't describe any emergent phenomena. Okay, so emergence is a non-mandatory property of the entire system due to the interaction and self-organization of its components. Why non-mandatory? I say non-mandatory. What I mean by that is emergence is associated with a loss of uniqueness in large-scale properties as some parameter is varied, such as temperature. So, for example, if I have a magnet at low temperatures, the state is found with the magnetization is found experimentally and in simulation and in theory. The state with no magnetization is also an allowed solution, but it's unstable. So when we solve the equations of a magnet, which we will do very simply, you will see that the equations predict that there can be either the non-magnetized solution or the magnetized solution, the solution where the thing is actually magnetic, but one of them is more probable than other. It has a lower energy, and that's why you see it. So only the emergent state exhibits generalized rigidity, which is an outcome of the collective interactions between the components. Okay, so what are we going to talk about in this quarter? We're going to talk about the onset of emergence. We're going to talk about scaling, phase transitions, and fluctuations. We're not going to be spending so much time talking about the phenomena in emergence. So let me just quickly go through that. So here is a phase diagram of a material. And if you're rusty on this, don't worry, we'll go through it. This is pressure as a function of temperature, and the blue is the liquid, the brown is the solid, the green is the gas phase. This is a triple point, and this is a critical point over here. And if you zoom in on this critical point here, what you observe if you look at it in a microscope in a little constant volume cell is you'll see that there's a meniscus between the liquid and the solid, and as you get closer and closer to that critical point, that meniscus vanishes. And why does it vanish? Well, the meniscus is the thing that tells you that the liquid is separated from the gas. Well, you can see here that the gas phase and the liquid phase, I can go from one to the other without going through this phase transition. So they're not really different phases. Okay. So that's one of the things that we'll be interested in. If I look near that critical point, what I will see, and I'm looking here at pictures that represent the density fluctuations in a fluid, in a gas, or fluid or gas liquid near its critical point, you can see that the structure has fluctuations. Black is high density, white is low density. Those fluctuations increase, and you get domains that grow as you get towards the critical temperature, and the system actually becomes a fractal. It becomes self-similar. And we're going to understand why that is. So there's two universal regimes then for matter. One of them is the regime very close to the critical temperature, very close to how the phase transition actually occurs. That's where you get what are called critical phenomena. They're called critical because they tell you about this critical point. That's what it's called. It's called a critical point. So that's a critical phenomena. And we're going to see that all the things I told you at the beginning, the things that are impossible, those things actually break down at that critical point. And there's universal scaling rules there. So here, for example, on the left is the magnetization of a magnet as a function of temperature. At high temperatures, there's no magnetization. The thing is not a magnet. It will not stick to your refrigerator door. As you go to low temperatures, what happens is the magnetic moments in the material, in the nickel or whatever it is, line up. It becomes magnetic, and it has a magnetization which grows with temperature as I go below this critical temperature. Next time we'll talk about how to make a simple theory of this. The simple theory of this would tell you that the magnetization grows as a power law as I go below the critical temperature. Now this is without any external magnetic field. If I draw the true phase diagram, external magnetic field in one axis, temperature along the other, okay? And you might say, well, if I take a magnet or material that can be magnetic, and I apply an external magnetic field to it, the magnetization should be proportional to the external magnetic field. You learned that on your mother's knee. That's called Curier's law. Okay, well, it's not true at a critical point. If I sit exactly at TC and I measure the magnetization as a function of external magnetic fields, then it goes as a power law. That power law is roughly a third. It's not one at all. Okay, so that's a breakdown of a linear response theory. And you can take these two curves and you can combine them into a formula like this. So this is magnetization as a function of the temperature minus the critical temperature, as a function of the external magnetic field, and it has this particular form. This T to the beta is this behavior here, and this F of H over T to the delta is subcritical exponent, another one, and this is a function of just one variable. The theory predicts that, and this was discovered experimentally, and it was explained, and this is the outcome of that. So let me show you here. This is the magnetization of a material, depends on temperature, and it depends on external field. It's ostensibly a function of two variables. But look, here I'm plotting the magnetization against temperature, scaled in the way that this equation on the previous slide tells you to do. It tells you to plot the data in a certain way. So you do that, and all the data collapse. What is all the data? These are data from 5 different magnetic materials, completely different materials. But when I plot them in the right way, they all fall onto one universal curve. And can you see the solid line that goes through those data points? Can you see it? It's hard to see. That solid line is the prediction from the normalization group. And it has no adjustable parameters. And it applies with no adjustable parameters to all of these materials. So why is it that all these materials behave the same way, and then the theory doesn't even need to know what they're made of? So this sounds to you amazing, right? Okay, you've all heard that quantum electrodynamics is the best theory because it predicts things to 10 decimal places and you can measure them and so on. And I've just shown you another thing like that. I've shown you that this fantastic model of phase transitions gives a precise prediction in agreement with experiment. Except it's not like that. It's much more interesting. It's actually a model of a model of a model of a model of a model that gives the precise prediction in agreement with experiment. Why? Well, the real model is if you said make a model of a magnet, you'd start off with quantum chemistry. And then you say, well, if quantum chemistry is too microscopic, well, I need to take into account that the outer electrons can be valence electrons and become band electrons. So I have to look at the electronic structure. But then I have to look at the magnetic moment of those electrons. So I have to look at the quantum Heisenberg model. That's a model of the spin dipoles. That's too hard. So let's just pretend it's classical. So we'll just throw away quantum mechanics. And that's still too hard, but then I'm going to make a ludicrously simple theory called Landau theory, which we'll discuss in this class. And that's the theory that gives precise prediction in agreement with experiment. Every step along the way here, none of those approximations could be justified. If you said, I'm going to do this, you would just say, look, I'm not going to listen anymore. That is a really, really stupid idea. I'm not going to believe that ignoring quantum mechanics can make a difference. Okay? But it does, it works. And when you understand it from the renormalization group point of view, then you understand, oh, and now I can tell which things matter and which things don't. And now you can understand why it didn't matter that I was making non-systematic approximations. That's the true theoretical physics success story. So there's another universal regime. This is the regime we're going to talk about this quarter. Next year, if I teach the emergence and order class, we look at what happens at low temperatures in the ordered phase. And there we find that we have all sorts of simplifications, high dynamics, excitations, topological defects, continuous symmetries. We can understand the generic behavior of materials below their phase transition point. We can understand the structure of matter without knowing very much about it at all. So there's two different types of universality. And physicists are really good at answering questions to do with universality. So in any problem you want to look at, you want to go and find where is there things that don't depend on all the details. And these are the two regimes that we know of where that applies. Okay, so here's the syllabus for the class. Okay. So on the left panel is the sort of coarse-grained picture. So I told you about levels of description. So here's two different levels of description. This is the level of description, which is there's 4 parts to this course. Emergence and phase transitions, how you classify them, how they occur in practice, scaling and the normalization group, and then anomalous dimensions and scaling behavior in systems even out of equilibrium. Okay, so that's the coarse-grained picture. The more fine-grained picture, the atomic level of description, or maybe the QCD level of description, is June the 6th, Introduction to Emergence. That's the lecture we just had. Thursday, Introduction to Power Laws and Dimensional Analysis. LPTRG, that's the name of my book, Lectures on Phase Transitions in the Normalization Group. Okay, and then there's all of this, and then here's the whole course, and then you go to the next week 6 to 7, 7, 8, 9, 10, all of the things that we're going to learn. Okay, all of this is on the website. So let me make this go away. We have 3 minutes left. So here is the website to the class. Let's make this go. All right. So here's the homepage for the course, and you can read that. If you want to get the lecture notes of this course, those lecture notes were written by me, and a publisher put a cover on it and said, here's a book. So I'm giving you the lecture notes, so you can just download them, and here you are. Here's all 395 pages, and that's what we'll be following in this class. So you don't need to buy it. Definitely don't buy the book. Just download it from here. There's lecture notes from the courses that I used to give at the University of Illinois. Videos are here. And there's an emergent states of matter movie page, which has really great movies on it of emergent phenomena. So please explore that. I use Microsoft Teams to communicate with you. So here is Teams. So go and click on that link and then follow the instructions I gave you to join into this. So if I look here, you'll see that several of you have already followed the things I sent you in email and have requested to join. So all of you should do that. And then we have here, so I have articles about emergence. So here's one from last year: effective hydrodynamics of locust swarms, and so on and so forth. I post these things. Basic statistical mechanics resources. These are lecture notes that I give on statistical mechanics and things like this. And then I will be posting videos of the lectures here, and so on and so forth. And this is where you guys, I'll make separate channels for each homework set and for lectures. You guys can post in here and talk to each other and say, wow, that lecture from Nigel was really head spinning, or what a load of rubbish, or I don't believe this, or whatever. So you can just discuss them. And when you do homework, I want you to collaborate with each other and do, you have to do your own work and hand in your own work. But I will encourage you to have discussions as the people who've taken this class have in the past. You have a question?
So you don't prefer email, you prefer on Teams?
If it's on Teams, I will definitely get it. And in fact, I shouldn't show other people's messages. If you have a question, certainly send me an email. I'm certainly not going to, but remember this: I get about, on a good day, I will get maybe 200 emails. Okay, I mean, over Christmas I was able to, go to inbox 0, but usually I'm snowed with emails. Some of them are I don't need to know, but I have a lot of emails. So no, as you're my students in this class, so the great thing about Teams is that you can just DM me. And those of you who've taken this well, some of you have been in this class before, or other classes I've taught. I respond to messages, so you can just chat. So that's the best way to get my attention. Okay. So don't phone me, but you can definitely chat me, and I will often respond to emails. Late at night and so on if I'm working. You'll never disturb me. If I don't want to be disturbed, I turn off my phone and all that stuff. So, all right. So we've come to the end of the hour, so I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop the Zoom.